Hello, welcome to my studio. Today we're going to produce a small landscape painting. On the screen at the moment we've got a simple landscape with an old shed, a lot of rubbish around it and a fence running down the middle. I use photographs as inspiration. Just because something's in a photograph does not mean you have to put it into your painting. So what I'm going to paint today is something like this, with the shed being the focal point and these trees behind it. But I'm going to remove all this tumble down shed here and maybe throw in a cow or two just to add some animal life to the scene. So that's what we're going to paint. I'll do a quick sketch, and we're going to have more sky than ground. So I'm just going to very lightly draw in that small hill. Comes up here a bit. Yeah. When I make a mistake or a correction in my drawing, I don't immediately erase the wrong line. I leave it there, put in the right line, then I erase the incorrect line. Otherwise you might find you put the incorrect line back in the same place. Don't need the hill running through it. The corrugations run this way. And we can't see what's happening in here, but I'm going to just throw in some drums and other shapes just to break that up, and you'll see how I treat that. Then we've got this big tree here, another one here, and a couple of others there, just very lightly marking them in with my pencil. Don't mind the tree line back here, so I'll put that in. That's it. Lampposts I don't worry about at this stage. If I need to put them in, I will. I'm going to put in a cow. Just start with a relatively thick rectangle. Common mistake when people are drawing and painting cows, they make their heads too big. That'll do. Then I'll put another one next to it. There we go. They'll have a shadow. And the fence line's going to run along here. But I don't want it to be so solid that it stops the eye moving into the painting. To help balance this, I'm going to put in some cows over here. They're further away, so they'll be quite a bit smaller. Okay, flip it over and wet the back. This is a small painting, so I don't have to wet this too much. But this is 300 GSM paper, so probably wet it about 3 times. All right, I'll wet it twice for now. Let that sit there. Let that absorb some of that water. And we'll mix some colours while we're waiting for that water to soak in. We're going to have a blue sky, some bright green for the tree foliage, dark green for the distant trees, and just a green and brown for the foreground. So for the sky, some cobalt blue. Pretty good. And for the bright green foliage, we're going to use some Aureolin or Winsor lemon. Any coolish yellow will do. Some Cobalt Turquoise. It's not going to be that bright, so I'll dull it with a little bit of raw umber. You have to test your paint on a piece of paper because you can't always tell, certainly until you're very experienced, you can't tell just how strong in tone a mixture is. For the ground, we'll have some raw umber. I don't want my ground to be as green as what it is in this reference. But I'll just add a little bit of Cobalt Turquoise to it. It's good. And then here we've got the dark green. Really don't need very much of that. So for this, it will be primarily raw umber with some French ultramarine. This gives us a dark grey-green colour. And I'll add a bit of Aureolin again and a little bit of turquoise. That's good, and that's our distant green. Once I start painting, I'll intermix some of these colours. So we'll start with the sky. And I'll probably put a little white cloud there and maybe another one over here. Just using the side of the brush, pushing the brush so these hairs splay out like that. Fill in some of this area up here. Then I'll clean my brush, take out about half the water. And I'm going to repeat the process, only now I'm going to be painting in the white area. And I touch some of the wet paint, but I also leave some untouched, because that's what will give us some extra light in the sky. Clean the brush, and then I'll come down here and paint down to the top of this foreground hill. So this is very dilute paint on my brush. The shed is corrugated iron, and because it's a blue sky and the corrugations aren't painted, they will have a small amount of blue reflected from the sky. So I'm going to just use some of this very weak sky colour just to start tinting the building. I've brought the very weak sky colour down to the top of this closest hill. Now I've got to be a little bit careful, a bit late to be careful, Joe. I didn't particularly want the paint to flow into the building, but because I'm doing this as a very quick painting, I have to put up with a little bit of paint bleeding onto the building. Here I'll just leave a little gap. There's a hill way in the distance here. I'm going to just pick up some of the raw Umber and Cobalt Turquoise mix, but dip my brush in water to dilute its strength. Paint around these cows. Not as critical because these are Angus cows, which are just a dark coloured cow. But if they were Friesians, and I wanted the black and white variation, then I'd be careful be more careful anyway, not to paint into the cow. But you have to be pretty accurate with this stage, because if you leave like a rectangle around your cow, it will look terrible later when you come to paint it. Now I'll pick up some of this green. We're just going to add a bit of green to the foreground. Now I'll grab some burnt sienna. Good. And then right now this is looking very plain in this area, so what I do is I'll get my size 8 brush, and we'll throw in some burnt sienna. Maybe a little bit of French ultramarine as well, just to dull it. Now you have to be a bit careful when you do this. There's lots of ways to do the splatter. I have a video on my channel that deals with the various techniques, so I might leave a link for that down in the comment section below. All I'm doing here is just breaking up the foreground so that it looks a bit more interesting. There we go. The main thing is to make sure your mix is thicker than the mix that's already on the painting. I'm going to quickly dry this area here so that I can paint the trees in the distance. If I start painting them now, they're all just going to run down into the foreground. All right, now, so we've got these trees in the distance, and they're quite a bit darker than these ones in the foreground, so I'll pick up some of this darker paint. We've got some way over here. For those, I've taken out, 3/4 of the paint from my brush. I'm going to dip the brush in clean water and then take out half of that water again. So that will give me, in fact I'll take out some more by tapping it on a tissue. Basically I've just diluted that dark mixture, and I'm going to use that to paint in these weak trees way back here. Don't mind this taller tree here. There we go, so I'm just very lightly touching the paper. Now I'll go into this darker green. And I know some of these trees are conifers, but we don't need to worry too much about that. These trees in the background are just helping to bring this shed into the foreground. They're not that critical in themselves. And we'll leave a few gaps through these trees so you can see the sky in the distance. Back here. And I also make sure these trees have some variation in height. I don't want it to look like a hedge. I'll pick up some of this burnt sienna mix. Just hint at the odd branch. And I'll add a little bit of French Ultramarine, a little bit more raw Umber, maybe a bit of burnt sienna too, just to darken that. And I'm going to use that to establish the top of this hill. I don't want a thin line there, so I'll just drag it up a bit because these lower parts of the trees are going to be darker in tone. And then in the distance, pick up some French Ultramarine, a little bit of permanent rose, the green. Some of these trees will have shadows, so we'll use this colour to just mark some of those shadows in. Again, it's all designed to make for a more interesting composition without spending too much time on it. And I'll throw in some trunk here and there. There we go, that's good. All right, when that is nearly dried, I'll scrape in a fence line along there, I think. And then we've got these foreground trees. Let's mix some French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna. This will be their trunks. Then I'll get my rigger. So I'll just put in these thinner branches, lifting the brush as I move up. Also, what I do is I'll drag the brush up, pull it back a fraction and change direction. And that gives me a more interesting branch shape. I'm not trying to make these too pretty. That will do for now. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now I'm going to paint the bright green foliage, and I paint it before the branches and the trunk dries. For this I use my fan brush. It's a hog hair fan brush, quite stiff bristles. There's lots of gaps in these trees, so they're probably early in spring. If you wait too long and the paint dries, you have to scrub a bit harder to lift some of that dark colour. Now, if you don't have a fan brush, you can still use a round brush. You just have to use it very lightly. For instance, what I would do, use it without a lot of paint so that the hairs splay out like that, and then you can just paint your foliage like that. But I like my fan brush, and for this exercise I'm going to keep using it. just a hog hair fan brush with about 3/4 of an inch of hairs. This is about 18 years old, so a lot of the hairs have been worn away. Now I'll get some darker colour, just some French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna in there. Just to darken some of the areas that have thicker foliage. The light in this painting is coming from this side, so you'd expect lighter foliage here and then darker as you move away from the lit area. Okay, so that's fine with the trees. I'm now going to get one of my pieces of credit card, and what I've done with this, I've cut it and then I also cut a small notch. You see that if I zoom in? So instead of leaving it as a sharp edge, like here, see how that's got a sharp edge? So instead of leaving it like that, I cut that little corner off, and that gives me the ability to scrape thicker shapes. If you try and scrape with the sharp edge, it never looks right. And now we have to paint the shed. And because the shed's going to have a lot of rust on it, I don't want any of the green mixing in with it, otherwise the green will dull the rust colour. So I'm going to start with some burnt sienna, a little bit of Scarlet Lake. If you don't have Scarlet Lake, any warm red, so it's a red leaning a little bit towards the yellow. Cad red would work fine. And I'm going to take out most of the paint. Let's just paint a little bit of this rust along there. Drag some from below. Main thing is not to have a very regular looking rust pattern. And that's pretty good. And then I'll have some rust here. Just some little dry brush strokes. There we go. Now in here, it's quite a dark area, and I've got this dark colour left over from the branches and the tree trunk, so let's paint that in. I have to time this right so I don't get a lot of the dark colour bleeding into the rest of the painting. More rust here. The other thing I do is when I come towards the ground, I make sure I leave some broken edges there, which will later be used to give the impression of grasses and that. I'll pick up some of these red colours and just drop that in. Maybe a bit of blue. That's really just so that it doesn't look like a flat shape and it hints at things inside. While that's drying, I'll paint the cows. So they're quite dark. These ones in the distance, I was going to say are lighter, but not that light. They're lighter because of the effect of the atmosphere. The main thing is these cows have to be smaller than these ones in the foreground, or the perspective for your painting will be wrong. I'm going to mix a little bit of French ultramarine and permanent rose, tiniest bit of permanent rose, barely touching the paint, and a little bit of burnt sienna, just to grey that off. And that shadow will connect them to the ground. That's pretty good. Get some of this shadow colour underneath them. Now these cows should be a little bit lighter still, and their shadow should be a bit lighter because they're further away. So because the effect of the atmosphere, as things move further away, they're going to get lighter, duller, bluer, and softer or less distinct. I might lift a little bit off the top just to give them a bit of form. This is a bit too dark in here, so I'm going to lift some of that down here. If you look at the shed, you'll see that there are some parts where the corrugations have lifted and they've got quite dark shadows underneath them. Because of where the light's coming from, the sides of this shed are in shadow. Mix some more shadow colour. Again, French ultramarine, small amount of permanent rose, or alizarin crimson if you've got that. and a little bit of burnt sienna, like some of this dark colour has burnt sienna in it. Don't want it quite that strong. Leaving a bit of a broken edge down here, down below. And then before that dries, I'll just get my fan brush. And that just gives the impression of grasses next to the shed. I'm going to pick up some of this rust colour. These trees would be casting some sort of shadow onto this roof line, so I'll pick up that shadow colour. And that helps add some more light to the roof. Now, underneath the corrugations, quite often there's a gap which can be quite dark. I'll let that dry a little bit. This has bled up a bit too much. Now I'm mixing up quite a thick mix of French ultramarine and burnt sienna for these posts. And another fence along here. But I'm leaving a gap through there. I don't want to totally stop the eye from moving into the painting. And these wires don't even have to be that noticeable. I just lifted some of the paint from there, so let's adjust that a bit. We're going to put in some grass here anyway. Quite often along the fence line there'll be a lot of grass, and you can see it. If you have a look at the photo, you can see how along that fence line you've got this tall grass. There's another fence here and you've got some taller grass along it. The grass is going to be longer in the foreground than it is in the distance. For these distant areas, I just use a diluted mix. Don't want a lot of paint on my brush, but darken this side. And we'll lift a bit of a highlight. These will have a shadow. This tree here will have a shadow. And this building will have a small shadow as well. I'm going to get some very thick paint, French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna, very little water in my brush. I'll put a window there and a doorway there. Just some extra corrugations. And I think that'll do it. I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters whose subscriptions help make these videos possible. And if you liked this video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be informed of every new video I produce. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.